Picture this scene for a moment. December 1940, London burning under German bombs, Churchill sitting in his underground bunker, scribbling what might be the most humiliating letter in British history. He's writing to Franklin Roosevelt, and essentially the message is this: we're the British Empire, we own a quarter of the planet, we've been the world's banker for a century, and we're completely broke. Can you spot us some cash so we don't surrender to Hitler? It's like watching the richest kid in school having to borrow lunch money from the new guy. How exactly does the greatest empire in history end up begging for scraps? And more importantly, what does this tell us about who really won World War II? If you like seeing the financial machinery behind empires instead of just the heroic movie version, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next disaster we pull apart. If you think you know how the special relationship actually works, stick around because this story is going to flip everything you thought you knew about victory and defeat. Let me paint you the official story first, the one they teach in schools and commemorate on Memorial Days. Britain stood alone against fascism. America generously helped through Lend-Lease. Together they defeated evil. Democracy triumphed. Everyone lived happily ever after. It's a beautiful story. It makes people feel good about the special relationship and Anglo-American cooperation. Politicians love giving speeches about it. But here's what that fairy tale conveniently leaves out. Behind every noble cause, follow the money. And the money trail from 1940 to 1946 tells a very different story. It tells the story of how America didn't just help Britain win the war, it systematically stripped Britain of every asset it owned in the process. This wasn't charity between allies. This was a hostile takeover disguised as friendship. Most people believe Lend-Lease was this generous program where America basically gave Britain free stuff to fight Hitler. The name itself sounds friendly, right? We're lending you things, we'll work out the details later. Don't worry about it. But that's not what happened. What actually happened was the most sophisticated asset stripping operation in financial history, and it was executed with the cold precision of a debt collector foreclosing on a family farm. Let me walk you through exactly how they pulled this off, because the mechanics are important. This is your tutorial in how superpowers actually change hands in the modern world. Not with invasions and occupations, but with contracts and loan agreements. First, they bled Britain dry. When the war started in September 1939, Britain was still incredibly wealthy. Billions in gold reserves, massive investments in American companies, railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, insurance operations spanning the globe. But here's the thing about modern warfare. It eats money faster than you can possibly imagine. Britain had to import almost everything to fight, and America was the only place selling. The Neutrality Acts meant cash on delivery only. No credit, no IOUs, gold up front, or your tanks don't leave the dock. So Britain started liquidating everything. Operation Fish, they called it. The British government literally loaded the entire gold reserves of the nation onto battleships and sent them across the Atlantic to pay American arms dealers. Picture that for a second. Battleships full of gold bars sailing through U-boat-infested waters because Britain was that desperate to keep buying American weapons. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history, and it was happening because Britain couldn't fight Germany without going shopping in Detroit and Pittsburgh. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid assets were gone. The Purchasing Commission in Washington was sitting on contracts they couldn't sign because London told them there were literally no dollars left. Churchill writes his begging letter to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt faces a political problem. He can't just give money to Britain because Congress won't allow it and the American public would revolt. He needs to make this look like a business deal, not charity. Enter the masterpiece of financial manipulation, Lend-Lease. Roosevelt sells it to the press with his garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your hose. He gives it back when the fire's out. Everyone's happy. Sounds reasonable, sounds neighborly, except the actual negotiations happening behind closed doors were nothing like that garden hose story. The man running the show was Henry Morgenthau, Treasury Secretary and financial hitman. Morgenthau's position was simple. Before America gives Britain a single penny, Britain has to prove it's completely destitute. Strip-searched financially naked, he demanded a full audit of the British Empire. Every asset, every investment, every piece of property owned by the British government or British citizens anywhere in the world. The British negotiators were stunned. This wasn't how you treated an ally fighting a common enemy. This was how you treated a bankrupt company in receivership. Sir Frederick Phillips, leading the British delegation, tried to argue. He pointed out that Britain had already sold its gold reserves. He explained that liquidating long-term investments during wartime would be a fire sale, pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war. Morgenthau didn't care. His orders from Roosevelt were crystal clear. Squeeze them until they squeak, then squeeze some more. The most brutal example was American Viscose Corporation. This was a massive rayon manufacturer owned by Courtaulds in Britain, worth over $100 million and generating millions annually in dividends that helped balance Britain's trade deficit. Morgenthau identified it as a target. Sell it immediately, cash to the Treasury to pay existing weapons orders. The British knew it was financial suicide to sell during wartime, but Morgenthau held the leverage. Lend-Lease was stuck in Congress, and he needed proof that Britain was bleeding. His ultimatum was simple: sell American Viscose or watch Lend-Lease die in committee. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose from its owners using emergency war powers. No permission asked, no negotiations. They were forced to sell to American investment bankers who knew exactly how desperate the situation was. Final sale price, $54 million. For a company worth double that amount. Highway robbery conducted with legal paperwork. But wait, it gets worse. Because the asset stripping wasn't limited to industrial companies. While the financial guys were arguing over stock prices, another deal was happening involving Britain's military bases. Churchill was begging for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Roosevelt agreed to give Britain 50 obsolete World War I destroyers sitting in mothballs, basically floating scrap metal. In exchange, he demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases from Newfoundland to British Guiana. Think about that trade for a minute. Britain gave America a strategic footprint covering the entire Western Hemisphere. They handed over the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. They allowed America to build military bases on British territory that would project American power for a century. All for 50 rust buckets that were barely seaworthy. It was the geopolitical equivalent of trading your house for a sandwich because you're starving. By March 1941, when Lend-Lease finally passed, Britain had been financially strip-mined. But the real poison pill was hidden in Article 7 of the agreement. Written in dense diplomatic language, it essentially required Britain to dismantle the imperial preference system after the war. This was the economic wall that held the British Empire together, the tariff system that made British goods cheaper in empire markets than American goods. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to tear down its own economic defenses and open the empire to American exporters. They were signing the death warrant of their own trading bloc. The British negotiators fought against Article 7 because they knew exactly what it meant. But German bombers were overhead, U-boats were in the Atlantic, and the alternative was starvation. They signed. As the war continued and America officially entered after Pearl Harbor, the financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded in size and efficiency. The U.S. economy grew by massive percentages every year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being cannibalized by total war. Britain stopped exporting entirely, converted every factory to war production, and abandoned its commercial markets in Latin America and Asia. Guess who stepped into those markets? American companies. While British factories were making Spitfires, American factories were making Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for the global market. America was fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the wealth transfer was complete. The gold reserves of the world had moved from London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted across the Atlantic. But British leaders still believed their sacrifice would be honored. They assumed that because they'd fought alone for 2 years, because they'd bankrupted themselves to save Western civilization, America would treat them generously after the war. They expected Lend-Lease to continue during Reconstruction, a soft landing for their shattered economy. They had forgotten the lesson of the Viscose sale. In high finance, gratitude is not a currency. August 15, 1945. Japan surrenders. The war is over. In London, crowds gather outside Buckingham Palace. Strangers hug in the streets. Bonfires are lit. Pure joy, the darkness has been defeated. But 7 days later, President Truman signs a piece of paper that devastates the British economy more effectively than any German bomb. He terminates Lend-Lease immediately. No transition period, no grace period, no warning. American ships loaded with food and supplies bound for Liverpool are ordered to turn around mid-Atlantic and sail back to America. The British government was paralyzed by shock. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, looked at the numbers and saw the abyss. Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials, paying with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt not in a year or a month, but instantly. The country faced what Keynes called a financial Dunkirk. Mass unemployment, social collapse, starvation-level rationing. There was only one option left: beg. In September 1945, a dying Keynes boarded a ship for Washington. He was sick, exhausted, suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. He was arguably the greatest economic mind of the century, but he was going to America as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization. Therefore, America should give Britain $6 billion as a gift, not a loan, but retroactive payment for holding the line. He called it justice. When he arrived in Washington, he discovered justice wasn't legal tender. The mood had changed completely. The war was over, the American public was tired of paying for Europe, and Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, which had been elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. The American negotiators were ice cold. No gift, no grant, only a commercial loan with interest. Take it or starve. The loan they offered was $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and it came with conditions designed to strangle what remained of Britain's economic independence. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain had to make the pound fully convertible, meaning anyone holding British pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. The Americans framed this as free trade, opening global markets. In reality, It was designed to break the sterling area. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds, but forbidden them from exchanging those pounds for dollars. This created a closed loop that protected British industry. The Americans wanted to smash that loop. They knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone would immediately sell pounds to buy dollars because everyone wanted American goods, not British ones. Keynes knew this condition was a death trap. He fought against it until his health broke, but the alternative was starvation. The British Parliament voted to accept the loan, describing it as a financial Munich, appeasing the Americans to survive. The loan was signed in July 1946. Keynes died a few months later, his heart finally giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory. Blizzards buried Britain in snow, coal stockpiles froze, power stations shut down. People shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because there was no electricity. In this frozen darkness, the reality of victory became clear. Britain had won the war, but its standard of living was plummeting. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the worst of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime. Then came the American conditions deadline. July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted: financial massacre. The moment convertibility was announced, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it for precious U.S. dollars. The money from the American loan, supposed to last for years, began evaporating. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. After just 5 weeks, on August 20th, the government was forced to suspend convertibility. They had burned through a massive portion of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was total. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the State Department. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping the Russians out of the Mediterranean. But with the treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford the soldiers or subsidies. The telegram essentially said, "We're broke, we're leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine. America stepped in to fill the vacuum, the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events. It was a regional power trying to keep the lights on. The economic misery continued. In 1949, the government was forced to devalue the pound from $4.86 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. But the final bill wasn't just paid in the 1940s. It was a mortgage spanning generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not a gift, but a commercial debt with interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the U.S. Treasury. Through the boom of the 50s, the gloom of the 70s, the Thatcher years, the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. 60 years after victory, 60 years after the parades, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. Let me paint you a few possible futures, because this pattern isn't ancient history. First scenario: reform and adaptation. Countries learn from Britain's mistakes, maintain strategic economic independence even during crises, refuse to mortgage their futures for short-term survival. It's possible, but it requires leaders who can think beyond the next election cycle and populations willing to accept short-term pain for long-term independence. Second scenario: repetition and decline. More countries find themselves in Britain's position, forced to choose between national sovereignty and immediate survival. We're already seeing hints of this with debt-trap diplomacy, where infrastructure loans become geopolitical leverage. The mechanics are different, but the outcome is similar. Asset transfer disguised as friendship. Third scenario, systemic breakdown. The entire model of debt-based international relations collapses under its own contradictions. When everyone owes everyone else and nobody can pay, the game resets violently. This has happened before in history, usually accompanied by wars and revolutions. Fourth scenario, the museum economy. Countries become economic theme parks, maintaining the appearance of independence while real power lies elsewhere. Think of it as the Disneyland approach to sovereignty. You get to keep your flag and your ceremonies, but the important decisions get made in distant boardrooms. Here's your mental toolkit for navigating whatever comes next. First, always follow the money, not the speeches. Politicians talk about partnerships and cooperation, but accountants know who owns what. When you hear terms like strategic cooperation or special relationship, ask yourself, who's writing the checks and what are they getting in return? Second, understand that demographics, energy, and mathematics beat slogans every time. No amount of inspiring rhetoric can overcome fundamental economic realities. If your country can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself without external support, it's not truly independent, regardless of what its constitution says. Third, remember that in any crisis, always ask who pays and when. Emergency measures have a way of becoming permanent arrangements. Temporary aid becomes long-term dependency. Crisis powers become normal governance. The price of survival today is often paid by generations who had no say in the bargain. The story of Britain's financial Dunkirk isn't just history, it's a blueprint. It shows exactly how empires transfer power in the modern world, not through conquest and occupation, but through contracts and loan agreements. It reveals the true cost of total war in an era where victory and defeat are measured in balance sheets, not battlefield heroics. Britain didn't lose World War II on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over London. It lost in the conference rooms of Washington, where financial hitmen stripped away everything that had made the empire profitable. The British people won the war, but lost the peace, emerging as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. They spent their inheritance to buy freedom for Europe, a noble sacrifice that was probably necessary. But in the cold mathematics of international finance, it was still a liquidation. The empire didn't fall through military conquest. It was sold off piece by piece to pay the bills for doing the right thing. And if that's not the perfect metaphor for how the modern world actually works, I don't know what is. The lesson here isn't that Britain should have made different choices. Faced with Hitler, they probably had no alternative. The lesson is that in the game of international finance, there are no friends, only creditors and debtors. And when the bills come due, gratitude doesn't pay the interest. So next time you hear politicians talking about special relationships and historic partnerships, remember Churchill's letter and Keynes's mission. Remember the Viscose sale and the destroyer deal. Remember that behind every noble alliance, somebody's doing the math. And in that math, sentiment is always the first casualty. If you want to actually understand how the next financial empire gets quietly liquidated, instead of just hearing about it after the fact, hit subscribe and stick around. When the next balance sheet empire starts to crumble, you'll want to be one of the few who saw the bill coming.